It's Wednesday, January 13th, 2021, and this is another socially distant edition of KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly conversation on media behaviors comes to you from all over the Missouri School of Journalism. I'm in the Futures Lab studio in the basement of the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and my colleagues, Kiely and Earnest Perry, join me from their corners of our school, too, through the magic of Skype. Hello to you, Earnest.
Hi, how are you?
Doing okay. Kathy, hi.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too. On our program this week, President Donald Trump's Twitter account is silent, blank. We're going to talk about what's happened since Twitter, Facebook, Google, and Amazon have cracked down on insightful speech. Madam Vice President Kamala Harris's portrait adorns February's Vogue cover, but does the editor's image choice reflect the gravity of her position? And Self magazine wanted images that more accurately showed vaccination, especially among people of color. So it shot a series of stock photos. Would this questionable move have been necessary if journalists had access to actual patients? There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to before our time is up today, but we're going to start with the chaos on Capitol Hill. Kathy, you have spent so much time in that building, the Capitol building, with the lawmakers who were there to carry out what should have been a perfunctory act. That was not what happened last week. Talk about your initial reactions.
This is a hard one for me to talk about. I have spent a lot of time in the Capitol. The Congress is really my favorite beat because partly because the Capitol has always been so open. And I think even after 9/11, members of both parties worked really hard to keep it that way because symbols are important, and the openness of the people's house to the people is very important. The members felt that. But I think it's going to be much harder to maintain that kind of openness now. And I will say that one of the great joys of working in the Capitol is that you are working in a museum filled with artifacts of American history. And it's really a temple of democracy. You know, the dome of the Capitol, if you stand in the rotunda and you look up, is the apotheosis of George Washington. So there's a lot of almost quasi-religious symbols in the Capitol. And so really what happened over the last week was a desecration of the temple of democracy. And I can remember after 9/11 how much I would think about this when I was walking through the halls of the Capitol, because we had been told, you know, we were the next likely target, and thinking about the possible destruction of that building and how ironic it is that it was Americans who tried to destroy that building. This is a really wrenching, painful moment, I think, for anybody who cares about this country and anybody who cares about its institutions.
Well, last Wednesday, as this was happening, as it was unfolding, there was, at least for me, a sense of emotional paralysis that as I was seeing the images of what was happening in the Capitol, either on the steps or inside, that it was really kind of hard to find the right words and how we were expressing what we were hearing. And over and over again, you would hear the commentators on television, you would hear a Chuck Todd or an Andrea Mitchell just saying over and over again, I can't believe what I'm seeing. I can't believe it. When for a lot of people, if you were watching Twitter at that time, it almost was believable because of the state that we had come to in that time and what had happened in the morning. Ernest, talk for a little bit about how the use of language evolved during the course of the day and how it has even evolved to this moment. We're hearing Kathy even use terms like desecration, the use of insurrection when talking about things going on in our own country.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I was kind of watching the coverage, and like you, I was struck by the language that was being used by the journalists, by Chuck Todd and by journalists that were on the ground trying to cover it, but also stay safe at the same time. And what I think the thing that bothered me more than anything else was this sort of disbelief in in the way in which they were describing what was going on. First, it started off as it were just protesters. Then it got to they were rioting and attacking the Capitol. Then it turned into insurrection, and then it was sedition, and the language just changed over the course of the hours and even the days afterwards. It happened very quickly. The way in which those who were at the Capitol, it was a siege. That was the one word that really jumped out at me was when they started using the Capitol as under siege, and I'm like, okay, now we've really gotten into some uncharted waters here in terms of how language is being used. But one of the things that really has struck me in all of this is the fact that you have journalists saying, this is unbelievable, this is a travesty, and I keep going back to, wait a minute. Since I can go back to Reconstruction, but I won't go back that far. Since Timothy McVeigh, you have had the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty Law Center, our own Justice Department, our own FBI, over and over and over again talk about this. What was the number one terrorist threat? Even going back to 9/11, all of these institutions said the number one terrorist threat was domestic terrorism. It named the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, all of them. This information was out there. And now we're finding out that there were reports, and there have been reports since the election that this was a possibility. And none of that was heeded. Okay. So the fact that journalists out there saying this is unbelievable, I can't believe this is happening, I never thought this would happen, that's driving me nuts because the information was there. It was clear as day, and it's been there for a long time. And some of us covered it. There were stories out there. There have been documentaries. There have been frontline programs on it. All of that, but it never reached the sort of mainstream audiences that it needed to, so that people could really see this.
Kathy, you were about to say something.
I would say, first of all, I appreciate what Earnest is saying. I do think it's important, though, to use language that adequately describes what's going on. And I think a lot of us thought we would never see this in the U.S. Capitol. But here's the thing. None of us ever thought we'd see a lot of things we've seen in the last 4 years. And none of us ever thought we would see elected representatives of the United States government dog whistling terrorists into our institutions. And so there is a shock there. I agree that there were certainly ample warning signs of what was going on. I think it's a natural human tendency to think, oh, that couldn't possibly really, would that really happen? But it did. And so I think the use of this language, although, as Earnest said, I understand his exasperation, but I think it's important to use these words to call out things for what they are, and it is shocking.
One of the things that there's a lot that's out there you can read about on our links blog too, that newsroom leaders had taken time to have conversations with the journalists who they were working with back over the summer in May and in June in the Black Lives Matter protests following the death of George Floyd. And there had been a lot of conversations about how and when to use the words protesters versus rioters, but that nobody ever thought to have that conversation about when to start using words like sedition, when to start using words like insurrection, which I think there may have been a little bit of reticence to go that far out of perhaps fear of being sensational in that moment until some of those conversations were had. If this was sedition, if this was an insurrection.
Well, what's interesting is it was so blatant in the time it was happening. I think, as both you and Earnest have identified, there weren't any conversations. People just started to use the words because they accurately described what they were seeing. I mean, we saw people being beaten nearly to death, and one guy was beaten to death, but we saw that there are photographs of it happening. Police officers being killed in cold blood. It's just jaw-dropping. Well, no words.
Well, I mean, to me, when you have Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, basically on the stage hours before all of this happened, saying trial by combat, screaming trial by combat, you can't describe it any other way than inciting a mob to act and to act violently. So, I mean, I think journalists they were calling it as they saw it right there, on live television in many cases. So, I mean, I think Kathy's right. I mean, you just have, at some point, you just have to call it like you see it. And I think there was reluctance to do that against President Trump early in his administration when the falsities, the lies, and that sort of thing. And once the journalists made the decision that you're going to call a lie, that pretty much opened the door for them to say, look, we're going to call this as we see it. And no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And one of the things I will commend him for is that when all of the falsities about the election started, journalists on all sides pretty much came out and said, look, there is no evidence to support the president's false statements about the election, period. And they've said it over and over and over again. So I do have to commend them for that. They did not let him or his supporters continue to say that the election was rigged and not come back and say there is no evidence either in court or election offices or any place else to support what he's been saying.
Well, but nonetheless, there are people who still go ahead and say it. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about the social media outlets. And I think that's one reason. I took a call I got a voicemail from a reader a couple of days ago. And this gentleman is absolutely convinced. He kept saying, count the votes. Just if the Democrats would just be fair and count the votes. And you want to say, sir, the votes have been counted over and over and over again, but I think really there are people who have been brainwashed by social media. They're living in their own little foxholes, partly due to their own choice of, made by their own confirmation bias, but exacerbated by the algorithms and artificial intelligence that social media platforms use to keep us on those platforms, so they don't want to give us news that's uncomfortable. And that is a huge, enormous problem. And I think it's fed this problem. It's allowed people to become convinced that they are right, that they are hearing some special message through their tooth fillings, and they have to go act in ways that are absolutely inimical to democracy.
So let's take this a little bit out of order and stick with the social media aspects of this again. Then the president being permanently suspended from Twitter, being kept off of Facebook until at least the end of his term, that extending to Instagram as well, leading to the further rise of Parler, which has since been removed from Amazon Web Services, supposedly according to its owner, to come up on another serving system within the week. Other platforms which have emerged very quickly include one called Gab and Weemy. In a lot of ways, Earnest, this is almost scarier because it's taking these insurrectionists, it's taking this hate speech and these conspiracy theories and pushing them even further underground to spread their messages.
Yes, it is. I mean, and this is where this is where they sort of lived, and then they were allowed to have these larger platforms. And now they're being pushed back by these companies because of what happened last week and the huge public backlash. I mean, now you've got, as you pointed out, all of these platforms, including YouTube, suspended his use of their platform today. So he's not able to go there. And now what you're seeing is that this sort of fight about whether or not they are in some way infringing upon the First Amendment rights And now you have legal scholars coming out basically saying, no, they're not, because these are private companies. And if they feel as if you have violated their terms of agreement, they can suspend you, which is what they did. And then you have people saying, why are they waiting? Why did they wait until now to do this? Why didn't they do this earlier? Well, because it was a financial profit for them to allow this to take place. I mean, it's just pure and simple. You wouldn't have the Alex Joneses, the Roger Stones, and others that you've had who have supported him and lifted up Trump and all of these organizations without having access to those internet platforms.
I think it's really important for leaders of society. It's very important that the internet platform providers have now acknowledged that they are the publishers that they are and are taking some social responsibility for that. Everybody has a right to their own opinion, but not everybody's opinion has a right to worldwide publication. And if we're driving some of these racist, bigot, misogynist nuts underground, good. That's where they belong. Because think about this. This was about 8,000 people, according to the crowd estimates I've heard. And I am sure not all of those 8,000 people rushed the Capitol. This is a very small, vocal minority. I cannot believe that the 71 million people who voted for Donald Trump approve of this. Maybe I'm naive, but I don't think so. But it is important that they say so. It is important that social leaders, whether they're politicians, whether they own big companies, come out and say flatly, unequivocally, this is wrong. And that's what the social media platforms are doing. We are reimposing certain social standards and norms and decency. And that is a good thing.
So another claim of a freedom of speech violation, which I think in a lot of ways falls under the same that we're talking about with the social media companies. Our own Senator Josh Hawley goes on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox last night, and he is quite upset that Simon & Schuster has canceled his book deal as well. Missouri has found itself at the center of all of this. Earnest, you were nodding your head first. Your thoughts on it?
Well, my thought on it is this. He should have thought about that before he stepped out there.
And was photographed with his fist up?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the choices you make have consequences, and the consequences of his choice to support the president's false statements about the election and everything that happened subsequently, the consequences is what he's facing right now. The book deal that he lost, the support of people who pretty much put him in office in terms of financing his elections, and everything else that's happening to him is a consequence of the decision that he made to support the false statements, and then and then to keep that up even after the siege of the Capitol. So I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he's getting what he deserves.
One other topic real quickly to talk about, and I want to ask you about this, Kathy. What is the role of local news in all of this? One of the things I was looking for as I was watching it, and I've talked about this on the show a lot, how I'm a remote control jockey, that I will go from MSNBC to CNN to Fox News, now because it's on Mediacom, to Newsmax, to ABC to CBS to NBC, and constantly be looking to see. And one of the things I noticed was kind of how slowly some of our local stations moved to their network feeds. Talk for a second about the role of our local stations in a situation like this.
Well, I think this is a really tough call for local stations. They're not on the scene, and so they're relying on oftentimes network feeds or some kind of a regional consortium. And I think, honestly, a lot of people certainly nobody really expected this to explode in the way that it did. Obviously, local stations, when they cut away from regular programming to any kind of breaking news, get a lot of flack from their viewers. They're very sensitive to that. But I do think it is important for local news to engage and to broadcast this when it becomes obviously a big news event. Why? Because local news is still the most trusted news, and it's important for our audiences to hear from trusted news sources what is going on in their world. It is a hard thing to hear unpleasant news about this country. It is very tough, and I think it's got to be tough for a lot of people, and I think probably a lot of people need some time to process. But hearing it from your local station and a place you go for your weather, for finding out what's going on in your local community, I think is very important, because all the studies show they continue to be the most trusted source of news nationally.
Earnest, when it comes to cord cutters who may also, they maybe have a la carte packages or streaming services where they may not have access to 24-hour cable news that's monitoring stuff like this, or access to C-SPAN even to get a live feed. How do local sources become, like when people have antennas that they use to supplement it, it kind of becomes one of those only sources in a big emergency like this?
Yeah, it's the only source, especially if people are used to getting their news and information from television. But I think one of the things that we've seen, I would say over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, is more and more people are migrating to their phones, and they're getting their news and information that way. So, I mean, quite often when I talk to friends and relatives, someone has alerted them to something that's happening, and then they will immediately go to their phone to get the latest news and information about what it is. Now, it may not be local, it may be a national thing, it may be something that I may not be interested in, but that's how people are getting their news and information. So when we talk about cord cutters, oftentimes they're cutting the cord on television and going to their phone or their tablet. So it's not like cutting the cord where you're cutting cable and you're going to antenna, that sort of thing, especially when you start talking about news and information.
Okay, we have a little bit more than 5 minutes left, and a couple more things I want to make sure we have time to talk about. A week from now, Kamala Harris will be the Vice President of the United States, the first person of color and the first woman to hold that office. Vogue magazine wanted to honor that, putting her on the cover of the February issue. That cover leaked this week, showing Harris in an open black blazer, skinny pants, and her signature black Converse sneakers. She's standing with a slight smirk on her face before a green background with pink silk curtains. It's the colors of her sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha. Kathy, contrast this with what's on top of the news, or of the online story, where she's wearing a pale blue business suit, striking a power pose in front of a neutral background. It's a very different message.
Well, it's the second photo that you described as a much more conventional political portrait, and so I like the one with the pink background and the Converse shoes. I think I'm a journalist, so I like a picture that captures a politician's personality. I think part of the problem here is the double standard for men and women. I don't think we took plenty of pictures of, say, Barack Obama and more casual poses, and people didn't object so much to that. But I think women, I remember when I was covering Congress, women members of Congress would actually worry about things like, should I carry my purse? Should I see that? So they're very worried, and understandably, because there is a double standard about how that's going to look. But as an editor, I totally understand why Vogue picked the first picture, because it's her. It's a very personal manifestation of the next Vice President of the United States.
Earnest, you've seen both photos. Which one would you have picked?
I don't know. This was a running conversation in my house last night with my wife and my daughter who's visiting, and my daughter did not like the casual picture at all. She felt as if this is because of her stature and who she is and her place in history, that the photo should be more than her casual look. She didn't even care so much for the other business likes. She goes like, it needs to be even better than that. And so, to me, I think, and as we've talked about on this show before, Vogue has a very tumultuous history when it comes to people of color, in particular Black women, and I'm not so sure that this was leaked. I think that this was that Vogue or someone at Vogue put this out there to see what what the reaction was going to be to this, and then be out in front of it. So I think it's more that than anything else. But as far as I'm concerned, having her out there on the cover of Vogue, on the cover of these magazines, in whatever way that she feels is the best way, is a powerful thing for me. And yes, it's important how she looks, how she's depicted, but let's not fall into stereotypes or fall into what we envision as what she should look.
Okay, so I'm watching the clock. We have about 2 minutes left in the show today. And one thing I really wanted to talk to you about as well, something Earnest and I have had some conversations about as we've been looking at coverage locally here in mid-Missouri, is coverage about both the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine and really either the lack of reporting on the distribution plan or the lack of transparency in trying to get that plan. Earnest, talk to all of us a little bit about what you were looking for that you haven't seen yet.
Well, one of the things that's really bothered me is, we keep talking about, are you in Group 1A, are you in Group 1B, and who's changing from one group to the other. Now they're saying, well, we're going to just vaccinate everyone who's over 65. Everything keeps changing, and there seems to be a lack of planning, a lack of understanding, a lack of transparency, and journalists are trying to figure out, what questions should I ask first? And hopefully I'll get an answer that's going to lead me to the next question. But it's difficult for the journalists because everything keeps changing, and you're not getting any kind of definitive information from state officials. And the feds are blaming the states are blaming the local. It is a complete mess at this point.
And at the same time, we keep seeing stories on television about people getting their vaccines or people sharing them. So there's also kind of this mixed message that things are moving along more quickly than they really are. I wanted to ask your opinion about the move that Self magazine made. They didn't feel like they had enough imagery that they could use in their coverage of vaccinations. So they went out and shot their own stock photos. They staged these images. There's some ethical problems here. We have about 30 seconds. Kathy, why don't you go ahead and talk about those?
This is something that we are emphatic about not doing at the Missouri School of Journalism. You do not stage a photo. If they want to do public service posters and make it clear that this is an image that was created to promote something, great. But you don't pretend that something happened and palm it off as news.
Okay, well, that music means we are just about out of time. Time ran out before all the things we wanted to talk with you about this week, including the deaths of Sheldon Adelson and Neil Sheehan. Sheehan being the journalist who broke the Pentagon paper stories. You can read more about those on our links blog. That's under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @views on KBIA. Our thanks to Travis McMillan for directing today's show, to Aaron Hay for handling the audio, and Tim Pilcher, who composed our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll be back with you next week for another edition of Views of the News.